Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to set aside, well, a lot of the conventional wisdom about emotional health. We're strapping ourselves in for a look at a truly radical idea.
It's an idea so provocative, it really demands that you fundamentally change how you look at suffering, pain, anger, the whole lot.
Right. And our mission today is pretty direct. We're going to dissect this single, powerful, and I have to say, frankly, life-altering argument that we are 100% responsible for every negative feeling we experience.
And the culprit behind all of it, all emotional suffering, is just one very specific psychological mechanism.
It's such a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. I mean, for decades, popular psychology has kind of allowed us to see negative emotion as something that's, done to us. We externalize it.
Oh, constantly. The news is depressing me, or my boss made me furious.
Exactly. And the core claim we're looking at today insists that those internal states, that familiar trio of anger, tension, and just that general feeling of being upset, are never imposed on us from the outside.
So they're a choice.
They're the direct result of a conscious, or at least a highly habituated and therefore chosen internal response. This dive is really for anyone who's tired of feeling like a passenger in their own emotional life.
That's the key, isn't it? The learner, the person who's looking for that aha moment is going to, I think, appreciate the simplicity here.
The elegance of it.
Yeah, the elegance.
Yeah.
We're so often taught that emotional regulation is this complex thing, managing 1,000 different variables, diet, sleep, trauma, what someone said to you an hour ago.
Right.
But this perspective promises a startlingly simple, unifying insight. It suggests that if you can locate and just disable one single root cause, you can bypass all that immense complexity.
If the theory holds up, it doesn't just simplify the emotional world, it grants us complete operational control.
Which is a huge
A
claim.
massive claim. It moves the locus of control entirely inward. And in doing that, it stops us from being in that, that infinite, exhausting feedback loop of trying to manage the external world to feel okay inside.
That's a great way to put it. If I believe traffic causes my tension.
And your whole life becomes about fixing traffic or avoiding it. It's an impossible task.
But if I realize I choose my tension in response to the traffic, well, the strategy immediately changes. It's not about external management anymore.
It becomes internal self-mastery.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if the core assertion is truly absolute, that no one, absolutely no one, can make us feel anything negative, then we have to confront that feeling. That instantaneous, overwhelming surge of rage or frustration that happens when someone cuts you off or a colleague undermines your work.
It feels involuntary.
Totally. It feels like a reflex. And that feeling is what we need to analyze as we jump straight into section 1, the sovereignty of feeling, the choice of emotion. So the assertion we're starting with here isn't conditional. It's absolute. We're not talking about degrees of emotional response. We're being presented with the argument. You choose to become angry. Period.
And that foundational statement, nobody makes you feel anything.
When you look at the specific emotions they cite, angry, tense, upset, it's pretty clear those are the very emotions we most easily and habitually externalize. Right?
Oh, absolutely. They are probably the most common emotional reflexes where we immediately look for an external reason. We're conditioned to see ourselves as the victim of these feelings.
That high-pressure environment is making me tense.
Exactly. Or my partner's messy habits make me upset. This entire framework is built on challenging that assumption, that emotional victimhood. It states explicitly, nobody makes you feel angry, nobody makes you feel tense, nobody makes you feel upset.
It's really a demand for radical personal accountability.
It is. It reframes the whole thing. It's not a simple stimulus response. It's a three-part chain. There's the stimulus, then there's an internal choice, and then there's the chosen response.
That distinction, stimulus, choice, response, that is a massive psychological undertaking. It forces us to believe that even in that split second when bad news hits or you get insulted, there's a micro decision happening inside you. Which leads us to the heart of it, right? Defining that precise moment of decision. The claim is firm. You always decide how you're going to feel. If we take that seriously, what does choice even mean in that kind of high-speed, intense, chaotic context? It can't be a calm deliberation.
You're right. Deliberation is way too slow. We're not talking about a slow, rational process. It's more like an immediate declaration of internal emotional sovereignty.
Okay, what does that mean?
Think about the brain's filtering systems. The external thing happens, the insult, the inconvenience, whatever. It lands. That information gets processed by the limbic system, which sends a signal basically, hey, danger, inconvenience detected.
Right, the alarm bells go off.
The choice is the microsecond decision to either accept that signal as a controlling command for your whole nervous system or to hold up a psychological boundary, a layer that lets you register the event without surrendering your internal peace to it.
Okay, so if I get cut off in traffic, the involuntary biological thing is probably a quick jolt of adrenaline, a physiological alarm.
Yes, that's the pain, the stimulus.
But the choice is whether I decide to pile on top of that jolt with a whole story of anger and injustice and escalating tension.
Exactly. You decide whether to let the adrenaline just subside naturally or whether you're going to actively feed that physiological state with a chosen negative emotion.
So choosing anger is basically choosing to accept that the driver who cut me off is a legitimate controlling cause for my internal disturbance.
You're handing over the remote control of your own central nervous system to a total stranger in another car, or to a deadline, or to a careless comment.
The alternative being
What?
recognizing that the event is inconvenient, maybe even damaging, but its power to emotionally control your internal state requires your voluntary consent.
This really forces us to challenge the common story we all live in. We hear it all the time and we say it, you made me so mad, or the market volatility is making me anxious.
And that narrative places all the power, all the agency, and all the responsibility for how we feel on the outside with him, her, the market. This framework flips that entirely. It becomes, I chose anger in response to his action.
Oh.
Or I am choosing to use anxiety to respond to market volatility.
It's a crucial distinction. It doesn't deny the difficult reality of the external event. The market is still volatile. The partner is still messy. What changes is the belief that these external facts have the right or the power to enforce an internal emotional outcome without your permission.
Okay, but this is where we have to bring in a massive challenge, because this idea of emotional sovereignty, when you take it to this absolute extreme, can sound, well, simplistic or even insensitive when you apply it to serious real-world pain.
The big stuff.
Yeah. What about genuine grief? What about trauma? Are we seriously suggesting that a parent who loses a child is choosing their pain and is therefore blaming reality?
That is the necessary and most difficult challenge to this whole philosophy. We have to make a really clear distinction between pain and negative emotion. Pain, the initial shock, the biological hurt, the deep sense of loss after a tragedy, or the physiological fear during a trauma that is involuntary. It's a biological, neurological, and often necessary response to damage or loss. If I hit my hand with a hammer, the pain is a reflex. I don't choose it.
So the deep hurt of loss is involuntary.
It is. The framework isn't saying don't feel hurt when you lose someone. Not at all.
It's saying what then?
It's saying that the negative emotion, the anger, the persistent resentment, the paralyzing self-pity, that narrative that this should not have happened to me, that's the narrative overlay we apply to the involuntary pain.
So pain is the reality of the loss.
And the negative emotion is the protest against that reality. And that protest almost always involves assigning fault. If a loved one dies in an accident, the deep fundamental hurt is pain. The anger directed at the driver or the doctors or fate or God, that is the chosen negative emotion rooted in blame.
And the argument is that while the involuntary pain has to be processed, the chosen negative emotion, the anger, the resentment, it doesn't actually help. It provides no functional solution, and it actually gets in the way of adapting.
Precisely. That distinction is crucial. It's the difference between acknowledging a difficult, painful event and choosing a destructive emotional response to that event.
And if I own the choice, then I could potentially choose a state that offers more utility in the face of that pain-like acceptance or calm resolve or practical action.
That's the empowerment inherent in this perspective. If anger, tension, or upset is chosen, it follows logically that it can also be unchosen. The external world is full of adversity, but if we accept this sovereignty, it effectively loses its power as an emotional controller. It can't be the puppet master anymore.
Because its attempts to destabilize us rely entirely on our continuing consent. And that's the foundation. Emotion is a choice. So our next task is to figure out why, if we have this incredible power, we're constantly giving it away. And that surrender, that failure to exercise our own power, brings us right to the concept of psychological inertia. We have to transition now to section 2, the mechanism of habitual blame. If they're really sovereign, why do we constantly fall back into what feels like emotional servitude?
This transition is where the source material gives its most actionable psychological warning. It says, if you're not careful, you will fall into a negative habit pattern of blaming the other person.
So this introduces the idea that the choice we just established is, for most of us, most of the time, no longer a conscious selection. It's an automated default.
Right.
So the initial choice to, say, react with rage when I'm criticized, it might start as an individual, maybe semi-conscious decision. Perhaps the first time I felt justified in my anger. But if I do that over and over again, every time a similar thing happens, that path gets, etched into my brain.
It becomes deeply etched into your neural landscape. It gets automated. The moment the stimulus appears, the criticism, the angry response fires without any intermediary step of conscious selection.
That's the very definition of a psychological habit.
It is, and it relies on neurological efficiency. Your brain is, well, it's brilliantly designed to conserve cognitive energy. When you repeat a behavior, whether it's riding a bike or getting defensive, the brain builds a dedicated, streamlined neural pathway for it.
Shortcut.
A shortcut. And this pathway lets the process be handled by the subconscious system, bypassing the slow, energy-intensive prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for conscious choice and emotional selection.
The problem is that while that's efficient, it's also really prescriptive. It's not flexible.
It sounds like the brain is making a cost-benefit analysis where speed is more important than emotional well-being.
Yeah, the brain decides it's faster to just default to blame and anger than to sit here and analyze the situation and choose a calm, non-reactive response.
Exactly. And the source calls this a negative habit pattern, precisely because it efficiently bypasses that principle of emotional sovereignty. Your brain has basically written a little algorithm. Whenever I feel threatened or inconvenienced, we default to anger and assign fault to the nearest external target.
And that denial of choice is the negativity of the pattern. It ensures you stay emotionally stuck, just driven by these pre-programmed responses instead of real-time choice.
Let's really detail the anatomy of that blame habit. It's a self-reinforcing loop, isn't it?
Totally. An external event happens.
Yeah.
A colleague fails to deliver on a promise. This triggers an involuntary physiological stress signal, that initial feeling.
The jolt of adrenaline again.
Right. And then crucially, almost at the same time, there's an immediate assignment of external fault. It's their fault I feel so stressed right now.
Yeah.
And that assignment of fault immediately reinforces the pattern. Why? What's the immediate cheap payoff?
The reward, which we often mistake for, justice or relief, is the temporary avoidance of internal responsibility. The moment you assign blame, you get a short, sharp burst of psychological comfort. The internal pain, the tension, the self-doubt, the frustration, it's no longer my problem to process or solve internally. It's their fault. We've successfully externalized the emotional debt.
It's an emotional default, like on a loan. Instead of accepting reality and doing the internal work it requires, we default on the obligation and externalize the blame. And we get this brief, false sense of moral superiority or release.
And that brief false relief is highly addictive. It reinforces the whole pattern.
But the system is fundamentally negative because it ensures that the next time something happens, you're even more likely to bypass the choice and go straight to assigning fault. You're creating a deeper dependence on the outside world for your internal state.
You're building a psychological mortgage, like you said. You're paying infinite interest for a temporary, fleeting break from self-responsibility.
This makes the concept of blame very specific then. If the feeling originates inside me because of a choice, even a subconscious, automated one, then blaming the other person is more than just finding a culprit. It's an act of emotional misdirection.
It is absolute misdirection, and we have to get into its psychological function. Blame lets us avoid the most difficult work there is, which is self-regulation and acceptance.
So if I'm sitting in traffic choosing anger, and I blame the city planners, I've outsourced the solution.
Yes. You don't have to work on your patience or your scheduling or your internal response to being inconvenienced. You just have to be right about the city planners being wrong. Blame is the refusal to accept the reality that you are ultimately responsible for your internal response to external events.
So blame isn't an accurate statement of causality. It's an assertion of emotional dependency. It says, I cannot feel okay until you or the world changes.
Precisely. And that dependency is crippling because it locks you into this negative habit pattern. If I keep asserting that I'm dependent, I guarantee my own powerlessness.
So this habit of blaming others is the direct structural failure to actually use the principle that you always decide how you're going to feel.
The choice is still being made, but it's being made by a robotic, automated habit loop, not by the sovereign, conscious mind. This mechanism is the crucial bridge. It explains how our failure to choose well in a microsecond builds the foundation for all systemic emotional suffering.
Okay, if the habit of blame is truly the mechanism that denies us our emotional power, and that mechanism is so fundamental, then the source is making the ultimate unifying claim about human suffering. We have to move to section 3. Blame as the core of the negative emotion tree. All right, let's introduce the central powerful thesis that really demands our attention here. The claim that blame is the core of all negative emotions.
And we have to linger on that word, all.
Yes, all. This isn't a partial theory, suggesting blame causes some anger or some frustration. This is a grand unifying theory. It's trying to reduce the vast, confusing, painful spectrum of human misery, from subtle anxiety to crippling resentment, even down to shame and self-pity, to one single, fundamental, and actionable cause.
The assignment of fault.
It's the ultimate exercise in simplification.
Right.
I mean, traditional psychology often treats the symptoms, right? It assigns different therapies for different emotional states.
Mm-hmm. Anxiety is treated differently than depression, which is treated differently than rage.
But this framework suggests that while the manifestations are different, they all share a singular subterranean root system.
And if blame is the core, then every single negative emotion we experience must, if you dig deep enough, be traceable back to that one decision to assign fault for a reality that we find unacceptable.
And if you eliminate that assignment of fault,
the source promises that the entire complex system of misery must, at least in theory, collapse.
To understand this structural claim, we need to deconstruct the visual metaphor they use, the negative emotion tree. If blame is the core or the root, its purpose is to anchor the whole structure and, draw emotional energy from somewhere.
It draws our attention, our focus, our justification. It pulls all that energy towards the external or internal fault assignment. The root is the non-acceptance of reality, formalized by assigning fault.
Okay, so blame is the root. What's the trunk then, if we follow the metaphor?
The trunk would be the basic mechanism of justification. It's the persistent, elaborate internal story we build to support the blame.
Give me an example.
Okay, so if the root is blaming my boss for my lack of promotion, the trunk is the detailed daily narrative that says, I am deserving, my work is excellent, and the boss is corrupt or stupid or biased. The trunk is the structure of victimhood and self-justification that gives height and visibility to the whole tree.
And the branches and leaves are the countless negative emotional states we actually experience. So the branches would be the big categories of distress, like anger, resentment, envy, frustration, anxiety.
Exactly. And the leaves are the endless, nuanced daily manifestations that drain our energy. The road rage, the passive aggression towards a relative, the persistent anxiety about a future you can't control, the internal loop of self-pity.
So if frustration is a leaf on that tree, its existence is totally dependent on the trunk of justification.
The story that I deserve for this task to be easy and quick.
Which is rooted in the core of blame. Someone or something, the slow computer, the bad instructions, my own past self, is responsible for this difficulty.
Perfect. And that implication changes how we approach emotional management entirely.
Because if you just try to treat the symptoms, the branches or the leaves, by, say, distracting yourself from your self-pity, or using coping mechanisms to quiet your daily anxiety,
you're engaged in futile, unsustainable effort. The root of blame is still intact, deeply nourished, and perfectly capable of growing new, equally painful foliage. There's pruning, but the tree is still thriving.
It's the difference between fundamental structural reform and just cosmetic fixes.
And the source is arguing that the vast majority of our emotional management techniques are cosmetic because they fail to address the foundational structural failure, the assignment of blame. Therefore, according to this radical model, the only efficient and permanent solution is to go after the root.
Okay, let's stress test this. The claim is that all negative emotions are rooted in blame. This is the critical test. We have to look at highly personal feelings that don't seem directed outward, like inadequacy or shame or self-pity. What about envy? How does this framework handle those internal states?
This is a crucial application because it forces us to widen the definition of the target of blame. Blame isn't exclusively pointing outwards at other people, it's the process of assigning fault anywhere outside the realm of sovereign acceptance of reality.
Okay, let's start with envy or jealousy. On the surface, I feel bad because my neighbor has a better car. My focus is on the car. Where's the blame?
The negative emotion of envy comes from blaming circumstances or people for your own perceived deficit. You're blaming the external world or fate or the economy or the structure of opportunity for why you don't have that car. You're comparing yourself negatively, and that negative feeling is propped up by the story that someone or something else is at fault for the inequity. If you just accepted the reality of the difference, they have that, I have this, and I am committed to my own path, the emotional pain of envy collapses.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's tackle the really internal ones. Inadequacy and shame. Those feel fundamentally rooted in the self, not in others.
They are indeed directed inward, but the mechanism of blame is identical. Inadequacy is rooted in blaming yourself for not meeting some standard. The person saying, I am not good enough, is applying the mechanism of fault assignment directly to the self.
They're rejecting their current state and assigning blame to themselves for the gap between where they are and where they think they should be.
Yes. And shame is an even more intense form of self-blame. It's rooted in assigning fault to yourself for a past action or a perceived inherent flaw. If you remove the blame, I accept that I failed, I accept that I behaved poorly, and I accept the reality of who I am right now, the negative emotional scaffolding for shame and inadequacy it collapses.
So the universal application holds. The negative feeling only exists as long as that internal judgment, that assignment of fault, is active.
Whether the fault is assigned externally to the boss or the traffic, internally to your current state or past behavior, or circumstantially to fate or the system, the moment of negativity requires that refusal to accept reality, packaged as blame.
Absolutely. The moment of negativity involves assigning fault. And that knowledge is profoundly simplifying for anyone listening. If we accept this core thesis, then the complex, debilitating task of managing emotional symptoms gets replaced by a single, focused, structural intervention.
We don't need 1,000 different strategies for 1,000 different feelings. We just need one intervention for the root.
That is the ultimate conclusion of this section. By connecting the dots, that blame is the core root, not just a symptom, we radically simplify the path to emotional freedom. So we've established the problem. Automated blame. Now we move to the incredibly high leverage solution proposed by the source material, which is section 4, the radical solution, simultaneous emotional collapse. So if the problem is rooted in one single mechanism, the solution has to be equally focused and singular. The source material outlines the active intervention required in these powerful, definitive terms. When you stop blaming and care, you cut down the negative emotion tree. You cut it off. You kill it.
This isn't passive reflection. This is a demand for radical, definitive action.
Yeah.
It requires a sharp, conscious, and absolute halt to that automated negative habit pattern we detailed in section 2. The language, cut down, cut it off, kill it, that's intentional. It implies finality.
You're not trying to prune the leaves of resentment.
You're removing the foundational structure itself. It requires a total cessation of assigning fault. Regardless of how justified or rational or morally correct the fault might seem to be, you are cutting the entire system at the root.
Which means the moment I decide my colleague is incompetent, and that justifies my anger, I've already failed the test.
Yeah.
The cut has to happen before that assignment of fault solidifies into a story.
Precisely. The acceptance of reality has to be total. It means acknowledging the incompetence, acknowledging the setback, but refusing to allow that external reality to be the cause of your internal disturbance.
Acceptance is the opposite of blame.
Yes. Blame argues with reality. Acceptance says, this is what is happening now, and I choose my response to be constructive or calm or focused rather than negative.
This sets the stage for what is maybe the most striking and theoretically fascinating promise in this whole framework, the claim of instantaneous relief. The source says, and all the negative emotions die simultaneously.
It's a spectacular claim.
Why simultaneously? Why not a slow, gentle fading away?
The simultaneous collapse is the structural consequence of that tree metaphor. If the resentment, the frustration, the anxiety, the self-pity, the envy, all the branches and leaves, are drawing their psychological life force from the single root of blame, then removing that single root has to cause an immediate universal system failure. That's
like blame is the emotional energy, the structure, and the nutrient source for the entire negative system.
Right.
So it's the emotional equivalent of an instantaneous structural failure. Like if you have a huge complex chandelier hanging from one single primary cable, if you cut that one cable, all the individual crystals and chains and lamps, what are all the unique negative feelings, they don't fall one by one over time.
They all hit the floor together instantly.
That's the theoretical justification. The claim here is that negative emotions can't exist in a vacuum of acceptance. They need the psychological fuel of non-acceptance and fault assignment to justify their existence.
And once the fault assignment stops, the justification for the feeling just vanishes. So you don't need 10 years of therapy to manage 10 different resentments. You only need one moment of absolute non-blame to achieve universal collapse.
Which is a radical contrast to incremental therapeutic models.
Most models suggest a slow, incremental reduction of emotional symptoms over time, pruning the branches.
But this approach claims that's inefficient because the root is still active, still capable of generating new foliage. The source proposes an instant systemic cure achieved by addressing only the root cause. This is a game changer if it's executable.
If the claim is true, then the very instant you genuinely stop assigning fault, to yourself, to others, or to circumstances, there is no longer any psychological architecture left to support the existence of any negative emotion. The pain might still linger, as we distinguished earlier, but the chosen anger and upset can't sustain themselves without the story of fault.
But we have to be totally honest about the practical difficulty here. The principle is stunningly simple. Stop blaming. The execution, however, seems almost impossibly difficult. It requires breaking that deeply ingrained, automated, negative habit pattern that we analyzed.
We're asking someone to stop the mental equivalent of a freight train instantaneously.
That's the core paradox of this entire philosophy, isn't it? The simple theory demands radical, sustained internal effort to overcome decades of automated emotional reactions.
The challenge isn't the philosophical understanding. It's the execution in the face of intense, high-speed triggering situations when the habitual momentum is strongest. We have to acknowledge that the brain is hardwired for this blame shortcut because it served an evolutionary function: rapid assessment of threat.
So to override that requires constant, conscious vigilance.
It does.
So for the listener who finds this compelling but is struggling with how to apply it, we need to focus on the tools. We need a way to seize that moment of choice, that split second before the blame habit fires.
Yes. The only way to combat an automated habit is with a pre-programmed, equally swift intervention. It's a 3-step mental exercise performed in real time that forces your executive function to interrupt the automated fault assignment.
Okay, what are the 3 steps?
First, catch the trigger. The instant you feel that physiological heat, the clenching in your stomach, the tightening in your chest, that spike in adrenaline, you have to immediately recognize that the choice window has just opened. This requires presence.
So you're recognizing the involuntary pain signal without accepting the negative story that usually comes with it. What's step 2?
Second, identify the target of blame. You have to stop for a microsecond and explicitly ask yourself, who or what am I about to assign fault to? Am I blaming the person, myself, or the circumstances? By consciously naming the target, you drag the automated process out of the subconscious and into the conscious mind.
Which is the only place where emotional sovereignty can actually be exercised. You break the automaticity.
You do. And the final critical step, the actual cutting of the root. Third, force absolute acceptance. This is the non-blame choice. You replace the assignment of fault with an internal declaration of acceptance. So if you were cut off, the statement is, this external reality includes an aggressive driver. I accept that reality, and I choose not to allow that person to dictate my internal peace.
And if I failed at something?
The statement is, I accept that I fail, and I accept my current capability. Now I choose to learn, not to punish. By forcing acceptance, you starve the root system of blame of its necessary fuel, and you initiate that simultaneous collapse of the negative emotion structure.
That synthesis gives the listener immense value. We've revealed a highly efficient emotional strategy. Instead of engaging in the exhausting task of managing countless individual negative feelings, the focus is placed entirely on the single root cause.
It simplifies the entire emotional battlefield down to one critical recurring question.
Every difficult moment becomes a test of this one principle. Am I assigning fault right now?
And if the answer is yes, then you know you are choosing the negative emotional state, and you possess the necessary, even if it's difficult, power to stop blaming and initiate the simultaneous emotional collapse. That's the challenging but ultimately liberated roadmap this framework provides.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into the sovereignty of emotional choice and the unifying power of blame as the core of all negative emotion. It's a philosophy that demands everything from you, but in return, it promises internal freedom.
To quickly synthesize the revolutionary roadmap we've explored, emotional choice is sovereign. Nobody can make you feel anything negative, only the initial pain response is involuntary.
Right.
Blame is the automated habit pattern that denies this choice by projecting fault externally, internally, or circumstantially.
It's the shortcut.
And blame is the single core root of all negative emotional manifestations, from low-grade anxiety to crippling self-pity. Finally, eliminate that core by actively, decisively stopping the habit of blame, and the entire negative emotional apparatus dies, instantly and simultaneously.
And here's where the perspective truly earns its depth. If this framework is correct, and all negative emotions from anxiety to shame to rage die simultaneously the moment you genuinely stop assigning fault. Just think about the sheer amount of energy and cognitive capacity you previously dedicated to sustaining that entire negative emotion tree.
All that mental bandwidth.
All of it. The energy you use justifying your victimhood, arguing with reality, managing all the symptoms. When that massive psychological structure collapses and all that energy is suddenly liberated, where will you redirect that newfound emotional and cognitive capacity? How will the world even look when your perception is no longer filtered through the constant requirement to assign blame?
It's a profound thought.
It really is. And that's something to consider until the next time we take the deep dive.